stays at the stick. From who's got it better than us to brick by brick, it's always the 49ers way, from off-season to game day. Yeah, we talk back. It's the 49ers Cutback.
It's 49ers Cutback podcast time. Welcome to the show, everyone. Glad you could join me to talk about the 49ers offensive line philosophy. And it's been something that has definitely been on people's brains recently, because the big conversation heading into the draft was that the 49ers had to find offensive linemen to help this team. Pretty much the consensus from most of the fans, a lot of the media pundits, everyone was saying the same thing. 49ers need to improve the offensive line and protect Brock Purdy, because that is the reason that the 49ers lost the Super Bowl against Kansas City. And it has been something that has definitely been glossed over, talked about from time to time, is the 49ers maybe lack of intense philosophy of getting good football players at the offensive line position, not expending high draft picks to bring those guys in. Besides Trent Williams, there's no other first-round pick on the starting offensive line. The closest to that is Aaron Banks. He was a second-round pick. Jake Brendel was an undrafted free agent. He's your starting center. And you go down the line and you start finding guys like Colton McKivitz that are fifth-round picks. So the San Francisco 49ers don't spend a ton when it comes to offensive line. When players have come up in free agency, they've let them walk, whether that is a guy like Laken Tomlinson or Mike McGlinchey. The 49ers haven't been willing to fork out a lot of money to ensure that their offensive line is extremely good. They've went with other methods. They've drafted players later on in the draft and looked to bring them up to speed and get them to the level where they could start. For some, they believe this is not the best way to go. This is not the most detailed plan to be able to protect what could be a legitimate franchise quarterback in Brock Purdy. So what do you do if you're the 49ers when you have all these players that you have to pay? What exactly is your philosophy on this? Everyone expected for there to be a first-round offensive lineman. I didn't really, because I didn't think there was going to be an offensive lineman that was one of those top 5 tackles that was going to be available. So that didn't make sense. But then people were like, hey, it's going to be second round. It's going to be, somebody big there. And the 49ers haven't been willing to do that. They did draft offensive line in the draft, but it didn't start until round 3 with Dominic Puny. And a lot of people wondering why Dominic Puny when you have a need potentially at right tackle with Colt McKivitz. My philosophy on this has been that the outside of the organization people, the fans, the news media, they believe the 49ers offensive line is much worse than the people in the building believe the 49ers offensive line is. And so because there's that disconnect, you get a little bit of a different thought process. So when the 49ers don't approach offensive line the same way that people see it, it somewhat frustrates them, wondering what is going on in San Francisco. Why are the 49ers not addressing offensive line early and often in NFL drafts? Well, we wanted to know what their philosophy was. Well, the media did a good job asking some pretty good questions to offensive line coach Chris Forrester, and Chris Forrester answered those questions about as well as you could hope for, and we learned a lot about what this offensive line philosophy is, what exactly they go after, and some of the things that are still to be determined when we get to training camp. But it's a good conversation, and this is going to open eyes. So if ever you wanted to know what the 49ers philosophy was on drafting, you want to know what their philosophy was on building offensive line, this is the episode for you. Do not miss out on this episode. We're going to listen to Forrester. I'm gonna chime in with my thoughts on it. It's going to be a fun episode. Like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I really appreciate it. If you're listening on audio platform, 49ers Cutback on Believe, please give it a 5-star rating. And if you're going to bet with Bet Online. Bet Online is your number one source for the NBA and NHL playoffs this season. Every stat, every matchup, and even live odds while the games are being played. When the game is over, head over to our online casino and get in on a game of blackjack or poker. or unwind with one of our over 150 slot games. Head to the website today to get in on the action. Don't forget to use the promo code BELIEVE, that's BLEAV, for your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Bet online, the game starts here. So this was an interview that I'm always interested to hear because Chris Verster is just a fun guy to listen to. He's also a run game coordinator. So during the season, you get a lot of intricacies. He's going to talk about run game, which, I feed off of. I love that part of football. It's just finding the angles, the avenues to be able to run the football against different fronts. It really intrigues me, the X's and O's of football. But as an offensive line coach, Chris Verster has a job that he has to do, and he has to put together an offensive line that can protect Brock Purdy and allow Brock Purdy to get the ball to the playmakers. And if he can get the ball to the playmakers, they can make plays for you. But just like many, you see situations where the offensive line doesn't always live up to expectation. And we've seen the 49ers consistently look for offensive linemen in rounds 2, 3, 4, and even round 5 at times that they believe can step in and become starters. That puts the emphasis on Coach Chris Verster to develop those players, to turn those players into key starters for this football team. So how exactly do the 49ers approach offensive line play? It's very interesting. But Chris Verster is going to lay it out. This first video and clip is absolutely fantastic. He's going to give you a synopsis of exactly what his philosophy is. And he says, I can't speak for John and Kyle. This is my personal philosophy, but it seems to be illustrated every single year when the 49ers approach the draft. And then after the post-draft process, it appears that this is the philosophy that the 49ers team has. So listen to this, what Chris Verster had to say about their drafting process and development process.
My personal opinion, this is my personal opinion. If they ask me, invest in guys that touch the ball. Guys that can touch the ball and score touchdowns. And then there's a range of guys, second, third, fourth round, fifth round even, that we will find starting offensive linemen in. At some point, can you draft? Yeah, you draft Trent Williams. You draft the pick of draft where you're getting a difference maker. But there's guys that can make difference that touch the ball well into second, third, fourth rounds, or second, third rounds at least, and definitely in the first round. That guy that touches the ball, it makes a huge difference in the game. The right guard makes a difference. We've talked about it before, but that's where we're able to find fourth and fifth round draft picks. And if they've been, you go find, it's how dominant is the difference between pick, 34 versus pick 54 in offensive line play. And that's what you're trying to balance all the time. So will we best available player, all those types of things? Definitely will. And were we possibly ready to draft guys higher in the draft? Yes. But if there's somebody that can touch the ball and make plays, in my opinion, you ask me, Chris, do you want him? I want the guy that touches the ball for me, because I think we can develop those players much more readily and have developed those players through the time.
Here's an offensive line coach whose belief is, let's get playmakers, let's get guys that we can put the ball in their hands and let them make plays. We can draft guys in the second, third, fourth, and he said even fifth round, and find guys that we believe can eventually be starters. So an emphasis on playmakers seems to be the philosophy for the 49ers. And I think we've seen that consistently show up through the years. I think this year is really evident to that. The 49ers could have taken an offensive lineman at the end of round 1. They could have taken an offensive lineman at the end of round 2. They could have traded up a couple spots in round 2 and got Roger Rosengarten, who we all know that they were pretty fond of. They elected not to. They elected to make sure you had guys that were going to be able to make plays, athletic plays. Now, Ricky Pearsall in round 1, and then round 2, Renardo Green, someone who goes to cover a guy like Ricky Pearsall. So the 49ers have a philosophy that we can get guys in that range, second through fifth round, and develop them into starters. And Chris Verster talks about the fact that this is a philosophy that he feels has worked. And why does he feel that this has worked? Well, Aaron Banks was a second-round pick that they developed into a starter. You look over on the other side, Spencer Burford in his rookie season, he was a fourth-round pick, became a starter. Colt McKivitz is a right tackle starter in this league, and they got him in the fifth round. And you might say, well, Colt McKivitz didn't exactly have the best season. And I think there's an argument both ways for that. I think there were struggles for sure for Colt McKivitz. Those are evident. But if you look at the PFF numbers and his stats during the season, it's very equal to what you got from Mike McGlinchey. Mike McGlinchey was a first-round draft pick for the San Francisco 49ers. He was a top 10 pick. You got Colt McKivitz in the 5th round, and he had the same production. So why wouldn't the 49ers think that is a proof of concept that I could use a first-round pick now on more talented athletic players that make plays in the skilled portion of the game, when I can get an offensive lineman in the 5th round that could potentially be able to play just as good as the first-round tackle we got. Now, there's always a special circumstances. The Trent Williams, those guys are game changers at offensive line. But if you're talking about drafting an offensive tackle, how much of a difference is it between certain levels? How much is the difference between a 2nd and 3rd round offensive tackle? What is the difference between a 3rd and a 4th? I think it's an interesting thought process. And I think it's one the 49ers are definitely going with, this method of we can draft guys in the mid rounds and we can develop them into solid starters. It doesn't mean they're going to be great starters. They don't have the talent for that. The talent of being a great starter is usually found early. Now, you do have guys along the way that you discover that were late round guys that end up being big time players, especially you see them guys like Jordan Mailata for the Eagles, who they got in the 7th round, who was a late translation from playing rugby to playing NFL football, and he's translated into a really good football player. Those are a little bit different than what I'm talking about here. But I think it's an interesting philosophy. Where do you get, though, this proof of concept originally? What makes you think that, hey, this is the way to go, drafting players in the 4th or 5th round and putting them in there and allowing the skilled players to be the ones that make plays? You have to either have that philosophy created somehow through conversation, or you have to see it illustrated. And Coach Forster is going to talk about the first time he saw this, and it kind of goes ahead and gives you an idea of why the 49ers believe this method can work. And here you go. Here's what Chris Forster had to say about potentially having any 5 guys ahead of some really great players, and good things can happen on offense.
There's a long time in the
I'm telling you, I did it when I got to Baltimore. A good friend of mine, Jed Fish, who's the head coach at the University of Washington now, he and I were talking, and he was a quality control guy in Baltimore. And New England was the mid 2004, 5, whatever it was. They were the rage. And I said, go watch that offensive line and just tell me how good they are. And he started looking at it. He goes, my gosh, he just put 5 X's on the board, nondescript, circled them, and said, it doesn't matter who those 5 guards, as long as 12 is the quarterback. He's throwing it to Randy Moss, Wes Welker, and those guys, Edelman. He says, it doesn't matter. And it didn't. You just saw that they did an excellent job. Dante did a great job of coaching them. They had a system that they believed in, and they got the ball to the people that could do things with the football. And he's like, I get it.
Granted, he's talking about maybe one of the greatest, if not the greatest quarterback of all time. I still lean towards Joe Montana, but there's whether you say he's the greatest or right there as one of the greatest. You got Tom Brady, you got Randy Moss, one of the greatest wide receivers. You had 2 of the best players when it came to postseason with Wes Welker and Julian Edelman. So, and he didn't even mention Gronk eventually down the road. I know Moss was later on. I think he said 2005, but Moss was later on. But the sentiment is there. You get these really great elite skill players and a quarterback that's able to handle it and pull the trigger and do the things that he needs to do to get rid of the football. And it's not like you can just have any 5 guys, but what does the skill set have to be of those 5 guys? How good do those 5 guys ahead of them have to be? Well, a lot of that's predicated on what scheme you run, what kind of concepts you have in your offense, how quickly you get rid of the football normally, and when it comes to passing, when it comes to running, what kind of scheme do you have? Do these guys fit the scheme for the most part? You know, you can't come in there with an offensive style the way Jim Harbaugh had when he came in from 2011 to 2014, that Greg Roman style offense, and then not have the offensive line to be able to get out there and push people around and move people. That was a different philosophy. Same with Steve Mariucci, different philosophy. Those guys have to be high round guys who can go ahead and get it done. And that's part of the reason that Jim Harbaugh had 3 first-round picks on his offensive line, a really good center in Jonathan Goodwin, who they brought in. It was a talented group. Now, you can't have 5, first-round picks across the line. It doesn't usually work that way. And if it does, it means somebody failed somewhere else and now is coming in to get an opportunity to play again. But it's an interesting concept. So you get a proof of concept, then how much can we make that happen? How much can we do that? Because if I can somewhat draft and develop on offensive line, then potentially I can spend money on other places. I can afford to keep Deebo Samuel and George Kittle, and I can afford to keep Brock Purdy and Christian McCaffrey if you're able to develop on the offensive line. You have to go pay big-time players on the offensive line. If you had to keep a guy like Laken Tomlinson, or you had to keep another guy that was going to play, you skimp somewhere else. So emphasis on those players is interesting. Now, does that mean that you can just put any 5 guys out there? Absolutely not. And I know that's the way he made it sound, but that's not true. You can't just put any 5 guys. They have to be able to exist, and they have to be able to slow up defenders. It's a little bit more difficult than that. But how exactly do you figure this out? What is the big trade-off, from having the offensive linemen that you need to having the skill players that ultimately can get it done for you? Well, Chris Furster had some thoughts about the trade-off as well.
Because we do have a specific things that we're looking for. We know what we're looking for through the course of time. That's the advantage of being together with Kyle for so long, that we kind of can pigeonhole these guys. Are we always right? Heck, no, we're not always right. And nobody is on anything. So, yeah, could you put 5 first-rounders across the front? I don't know that we have to have success, and it hasn't been that case as far as running the football and protecting the quarterback. Do we have – yeah, we don't have 5 first-rounders, so there's always going to be that. But the fact that you can throw a short pass to Deebo, even though the right tackle's getting beat, it ends up being a 60-yard touchdown. So, yeah, the right tackle blocks somebody, but if the guy gets tackled at 5 yards, you don't have the 60-yard touchdown. Boy, that right tackle did a great job. What's it matter if the guy touching the ball can't take it to the house? So there's the trade-off, and you're constantly playing that game.
It's interesting, right? The thought that he gives is you got a right tackle that's really good, and he makes a great block. And the receiver's not quite as talented. He makes a catch and he gets 5 yards. That's great. Now, let's say the trade-off is you don't have as good of a right tackle, but you have Deebo Samuel out there. Deebo catches that ball. The right tackle doesn't do a great job making his block, but Deebo takes the ball 60 yards to the house for a touchdown. It's interesting because that dynamic play explains it. I think most people would argue that what happens the other plays, is it more consistent to have the really good right tackle that can help you get those 5, 6, 7 yards every single time, or is it better to have these whole shot plays? It's a trade-off that you have to try to figure out. Skilled player to offensive line, which one are you more determined to have? And the 49ers have determined that at least for the other 4 offensive linemen, not the left tackle, but the other 4 offensive linemen, we prefer skilled players that can make it, or that can get it done. And then we're going to take the trade-off of we're expecting our skilled players to make big plays and our offensive line to just do enough. That seems to be the philosophy right now for the 49ers, is to get offensive linemen that can do enough. But what point is it that enough is not quite enough? It seems like that could be a little bit of a dangerous game. We already talked about the fact you got an undrafted free agent starting at center, and that's not something that's crazy for offensive line. Guys can definitely step up and be able to play offensive line, and Brindle's had moments where he looked really good, and he's had inconsistencies just like all offensive linemen do. But the 49ers definitely have a lot of late-round picks on their offensive line. How do you know when you're running into an issue with the fact that potentially these guys just aren't good enough to hold up? And I think there's a lot of people that would say the Super Bowl was proof that the 49ers didn't have the offensive line good enough. So where is that thin line between good enough and bad? Chris Furster talks about the philosophy of, that thin line and what could happen if you fall below that thin line, but also what happens if you're at that thin line or above.
Now, there's a line, and this is what I always say with offensive line play, and this is a cool discussion. I love this discussion. There's a line below which that with offensive line play that if you just drop a little bit below it, it's a gaping hole. It's just all of a sudden you're like, he can't block anybody. And now we got a major problem. But as long as they're at that line and just above it, you can survive it, and you can take care of them. We've got ways within our system. We can chip. We can do all sorts of things to help guys. Slide lines, double team the best rusher on the team. There's so many mechanisms to help a lineman that's insufficient. If a guy can't get open, If a guy can't catch the ball and run, that's where we have a problem. But an offensive line play, you got to be careful. You got to have those 6, 7, 8 guys that are just at that line or above, and that's the challenge. Where's that line in the draft? Is it the 3rd round, 2nd round, 4th round, 5th? When's that line where all of a sudden the tackles have dried up, the guards have dried up? Now you're talking about drafting backup players, which is fine. They're backup players, but they're not going to be long-term starters for your team, and that's the challenge for me. Because eventually the guys that can run and score touchdowns run out. They're not there anymore. So you have to find those quality starters at other positions.
He likes having the conversation. And I'm sure this is a conversation they've had a lot. They've probably talked about this in the front office. They've talked about this in the coaching staff. I'm sure Coach Chris Foerster has talked about it a lot with Kyle Shanahan because you've got to figure out exactly what kind of player you need. And you could hear him sort of talking through what's the cutoff for a player that's talented enough to be a starter in the NFL. Is that 4th? Is that 5th round? Right? I mean, the 49ers wondering exactly where that's going to be. With Dominic Pooney, they took him in the 3rd round. With Aaron Banks, they took him in the 2nd round. Maybe they're a little bit more hesitant about 4th or 5th round picks. Colt McKivitz with a 5th round pick. But we know they had a 3rd round grade on him. Spencer Burford was a 4th round pick. So they're wondering where is that kind of cutoff to find an offensive lineman that could start in the NFL that's talented enough to be a starter and not a perennial backup. You're always going to have guys you draft later that could potentially step in and become starters and they overachieve or do things you didn't believe they could do. But talent-wise, where's that cutoff? That's the tough part. And what a tough statement and what a tough philosophy to have that you are going to try to get an offensive line that is good enough to eclipse that level. Because if it doesn't, then it kind of starts looking like Patrick Mahomes did in the 2020 Super Bowl. All the talent in the world, Travis Kelce, Tyreek Hill. I mean, the team was through the roof talent-wise, but the offensive line was bad. And it looked like Patrick Mahomes had no one in front of him, and I think that's when the Kansas City Chiefs fell below that line. That's their only Super Bowl loss, when they allowed that offensive line to go beyond that threshold that Coach Chris Foerster is talking about. And last year, I don't know if the 49ers offensive line was as bad as that. In fact, I don't think it was. 2020 Chiefs offensive line was definitely worse, and Mahomes is a special player, so he can overcome that. But when it comes to the 49ers, I think it was attention to detail and a lot of facts that was a problem for this offensive line. So finding this level is the thing the 49ers are trying to do, and they're trying to make sure they stay above it. I think Trent Williams helps with that. I think there's mechanisms like Chris Foerster has talked about, to be able to help your offensive line overcome certain obstacles that they could face. That will allow you to keep the type of players you want on the outside, the type of skill players you want within the offense. But you have to make sure you can draft and develop these offensive linemen. And it's not easy, but you're getting a clear picture of what the 49ers philosophy is. They are definitely valuing and putting value on skill players as far as drafting high because they believe you can get more important speed, more important elements of those players higher in the draft than you can later in the draft. And then they're going ahead and taking offensive linemen later, believing that that's a strength of their football team to be able to develop those guys to be just good enough because of proof of concept. Now, they're hoping they're going to get star players out of it, but they're hoping they at least get consistent play out of them so that way they can get their skill players the ball and those guys can go make big plays. And it has worked. A lot of times the 49ers have scored a lot of points. So it's an interesting dynamic so far, the philosophy of what they're doing there. But if you're going to be drafting these guys in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, how do you know that these guys are guys that could potentially develop? How can they be above that line? How can they be talented enough to play for your football team? And it's an interesting thought process because if you have a concept and you have a philosophy of doing things, you also have to have a criteria for those players that are going to meet that philosophy. So what exactly is that criteria? Where here he is, he's going to start talking about, we're going to go through some clips here in the next few minutes where we're going to talk about what the criteria is for those guys and why they think they can find guys they locate that have a particular set of skills that they really like that they can develop. So here's Coach Foerster talking about that.
Well, that's one of the things that all these guys we took this year, and that one of the things are, and John spoke about it probably to you guys in the draft, and I'll keep talking all day. So, but what he said is, he said, look, he goes, we found that with offensive linemen that the what it takes, the character, the intelligence, all those things. Not saying one of our guys don't have it, but those picks after those first couple talent round, the guys are just playing because of sheer ability and talent. Those guys in the offensive line, they got to have that thing that they can figure it out. They're at some point you don't make it as a player, you coach. It's an offensive lineman because the game, you understand the game, you're intrigued by the game. It's cool to coach it, teach the little pieces of it and all that stuff like that. And that's what these guys have to be. They literally have to be coaches on the field. And so sometimes the further away you get from the ball, the tackles, they have to have a little bit less of it. And that's what analytics has found out, that as we start analyzing those character traits, those intelligent traits, that we've kind of found out that as you go with offensive line, it tends to be a little bit more leans that direction. Now, is that everybody? I don't know how that works for every other team in the league, but for us, those types of guys. So
what are they doing with those mid-round guys? They're betting on intelligence. They're betting on their football intelligence to be able to get them over the top. So that's one of the things that most coaches understand is players have physical limitations. The smart players are the ones who understand they have physical limitations, and they put in effort in other ways to overcome those physical limitations. So they work harder, they study more, they prepare their bodies to make sure they can maximize what they have. The truly talented players don't always have to do that. So the truly talented players get drafted in the first couple of rounds. They're better than everybody else physically. So what the 49ers are starting to do is when you get into an area from rounds 3 through 5, where you've got a tremendous group of players that are in that area, is you're looking for the players you feel can handle the offense the best. The guys who can transition to the game because they're super intelligent. They're like coaches on the field. They're going to be able to think on the fly. They're hoping that the intelligence factor will separate them from the other guys who are taken in that range who have similar athleticism. Because once you start getting into rounds 3 and 5, how much different are the players that are there? You're usually betting on upside, or you're betting on a guy who's had a very successful college career, but didn't exactly have the best talent or intangibles to be one of those top round picks. So what do? You get into their character, you get into their intelligence, you get into their work ethic, and you try to locate players that are good in that area. You figure if they're smart, they have the desire, they're going to work hard, they might just be able to make it. So you can see their value now and what they are looking at when you get into rounds 3, 4, and 5 for a offensive lineman that fits their system. And they believe it's a little bit easier to find those guys that fit that mold. For offensive tackles, it's a little bit harder. And I believe part of the thing with the 49ers philosophy is that's why they don't really draft offensive tackles post round 2, because they don't believe they're going to get a guy that's talented enough to be able to do what they need to do. So let's take a guy and that's super intelligent and let's put him inside and let's take advantage of where he might have been not as talented as a tackle. He's talented enough as an offensive guard in the NFL, and then he has the intelligence. He's a coach on the field. He thinks. And those types of things give the 49ers advantages, and you're hoping that these guys are going to work out. And if they do have some talent, if they're a guy like Dominic Pooney or a guy like Spencer Burford who have displayed physical talent as well, what you're hoping is that you're going to get extreme upside and you're going to get a starter for a long time. So here's the philosophy for the 49ers of why they're getting those guys in that 3 through 5 range, and now the philosophy of why they select who they select. They're really looking at the mindset. They're looking at the intelligence level, their ability to process football fast. It's definitely one of the things that I've been wanting them to say, because even though you believe it, you want to have it confirmed, because this is the philosophy coming from the exact mouth you want to hear it from, the offensive line coach who works with these guys every single day. Now, one of the problems with the 49ers in the Super Bowl was Spencer Burford blew a huge block, and we see this happen from time to time. And Chris Verster is talking about that intelligence level when it comes to offensive line, and there's certain things that you have to do to make sure you're very significant as an offensive lineman. You have to have good technique. You, of course, have to be talented. You have to be intelligent, but you have to do more than that. It's not just run blocking. It's not just pass blocking, and he's going to tell you more about what it is in this clip here.
The offensive line play, we've talked about it before, consistency, talent, all this ability in the world. But, man, when it comes down to things happening quickly, being consistent, play in and play out, understanding the offense, how the defense plays it, every little intricate piece of this thing. It's not just about pass blocking and run blocking. There's so much that goes into it that you just miss a little detail, a little adjustment. And a lot of times it's things that come up that I can't cover. You have to understand and embrace the concept of the play or whatever we're doing, so to know that, oh, gosh, but if I follow my rules, this is where it takes me.
You have to know the rules. And so every single offense has certain rules that guide you along the way. Certain things, especially as offensive linemen, that you have to know. Hey, if this guy comes here and lines up here, then I'm going to do this. If this linebacker's lined up here, I'm going to block him here. If I pull and there's a guy there that I'm supposed to kick out, I'm going to kick him out, and there's lots of things that you have to know as offensive linemen. But Coach Forster is saying, I can't possibly tell you everything you need to know. So when our original game plan's in, I'm going to instruct you as much as I can about what you're going to see from that defense. But if something changes and it's something that we weren't prepared for, you need to be able to think on the fly and operate within the rules of this offense. So knowing the play, knowing what everyone's doing is important for you to be able to know what your role is. That's how you can think on your feet. One of the things that made the 49ers offensive line so good back in the 80s was Bob McKittrick's ability and attention to detail. And that offensive line, yes, they were definitely built for that particular offense. They were quick, they were athletic, they used the things that they were allowed to use, but every single one of them operated within the rules. Part of that is because Bob McKittrick's attention to detail when it came to rules. But they also had to think on the fly. When somebody throws something at you you're not expecting, you got to be able to understand what you're allowed to do, what you're supposed to do, and then do it. What you had in the Super Bowl was a situation where Spencer Burford knew within the rules what his job responsibility was. However, it didn't register at the moment, and he failed to make the block that he was supposed to make. So that is more about the intellect part of it and the football knowledge of it in a young player that's trying to develop than it is about a ability physically to make the play. So the value that the 49ers are putting on interior offensive linemen and guys drafted within the 3rd through 5th rounds with intelligence, I think it's clear with several players that you look. And some of them work out. Aaron Banks, extremely intelligent. He's done a really good job. Spencer Burford, his rookie year, he did a really good job. Now Dominic Pooney, we'll see what he does. But also just look at the value of intelligence for the guy like Nick Zakelj, who they believe is extremely smart. Has it worked out? No. And like Chris Forster said, are we going to hit on all these? No. There's no way to hit on every single offensive lineman. You're hoping it's going to translate, but the value of intelligence is definitely something the 49ers are putting value on. And so we're getting a clear picture of why they draft him. And then within the offense, why it's so important to know the rules. For coaches, a lot of times we know this, but there's a lot that goes into playing offensive line more than just lining up and blocking the guy ahead of you. In fact, with some of these schemes, you don't even block the guy ahead of you. You have to block somebody somewhere else. You have to work up to second level and block a linebacker. It's your job to get outside and block a nickel corner or get on a corner or block a safety. There's a lot of responsibilities. And then if you're pulling more than one guy, there's a lot that goes into this. I mean, this is not just as simple as the play, block the guy in front of you. That is old school thought process. It's completely different in the NFL. It's completely different in football in general. So you're getting an idea there. But one of the things that you have to do to make sure when he's talking about you being above that threshold is, I've been talking about this for a little while now, is consistency. Consistency is extremely important. And he's going to give an example why consistency is so important. Consistency is the difference between a winning football team and a losing football team. You're consistent, you're going to have more good plays than you're going to have bad. Unless you're just consistently bad, then, well, there's no helping you. That's how you end up going 0-16 like old school Detroit. But if you're consistent in good play and you have more good plays than you have bad plays, that consistency helps you win. So here's Chris Forster talking about consistency, an example of why one player started over the other.
That's what we're looking for in that position. That position right now, that's how a guy like Feliciano played with just a little more consistency. And was it a lot? I say no. I mean, when somebody said how Spencer came to me when we didn't put him back in the lineup, he goes, Coach, he goes, am I playing? I said, no, but it's 2 or 3 plays. It's just 2. It's not many. You know, everybody else is grading here, and you're just those 2 or 3 plays a game, and you just don't know when they're going to show up and how they're going to show up. And so those 2 or 3 plays are just like, gosh, we just got to get those 2 or 3 plays better. We're just looking for that consistency. Maybe it comes from Spencer this year.
2 or 3 plays. That's a difference between being a starter like John Feliciano was and being a backup like Spencer Burford was. 2 or 3 plays. That's how important consistency is. Because those 2 or 3 plays, if Spencer Burford is consistent on, could end up, when you get that ball into your playmaker's hands, end up being a touchdown. It could give Brock Purdy an extra second. It could give Christian McCaffrey a little bit bigger of a hole where they can make something happen for the football team. So yeah, that's how close and razor thin it is. Spencer Burford's consistency at right guard is the difference between you falling below that threshold and you being just at or above that threshold. That is the thin line the 49ers are playing with this philosophy. For some, they might not like it at all. For others, they see that this is maybe a method that the 49ers are supposed to go to because of the dynamic weapons that they add. You have to have playmakers in this league. And it looks like the other teams in the league are thinking the same thing. We see a team like Miami Dolphins that just bring back Jalen Waddle for a contract extension to go with Tyreek Hill. Now they have 2 of the top 4 paid wide receivers in the entire league. The days of not paying wide receivers is definitely out the window. You have to value skilled players. 49ers just brought back Juwan Jennings on a contract extension. So it's extremely interesting the method that the 49ers are going with. But so far, can we argue of the results? And I know the ultimate result is not the best result. They have lost the Super Bowl. They did not win. And at that moment, that critical moment, an offensive lineman made a mistake. Was it a physical trait or a mental mistake? I think that's what people can argue. I believe it was a mental mistake by Spencer Burford. And I don't think that ultimately that is going to define Spencer Burford and who he is. But Spencer Burford's got to be more consistent. Chris Verster just said. And I think that's the argument. How can you be consistent? At the moment, you have to be consistent. The biggest moment, you have to make a play. And like he said, that's why we have to get guys that can create separation. That's when we have to get guys. You don't have guys who can't get open. Well, it doesn't matter how good your offensive line is. They're eventually going to lose. If you had 5 Trent Williams across the board, but none of your receivers can get open, Brock Purdy's eventually going to get sacked. So there is a trade-off and a give and take there, and that's an extreme example of. But let's listen to what he has to say about right guard, because right guard has been something people have talked about, right tackle especially. But it looks like Colton McKivitz is going to be set and solid at right tackle. Maybe Chris Hubbard comes in and pushes him a little bit. We'll see about that. But right guard, because the report is at OTAs, Dominic Pooney is taking snaps at right guard. That means you got Spencer Burford at right guard. You got John Feliciano, who is a supposed starter. And we heard the inconsistencies of Spencer Burford, 2 or 3 plays. Can he make that up? Do we have a real competition here? How good is Burford? Can he possibly win this right guard spot?
Obviously, he's the most talented of the players. I think he's as talented or more than Pooney. Pooney will push that from that. And John's just a guy that is a veteran, good player that knows how to get it done. Very savvy, good vet player. But these talented guys, when they figure it out, and that's what you keep hoping. So maybe it comes from Spence, maybe it comes from Pooney, maybe it comes from somebody else. I don't know where it comes from, but we're hoping we can get just a little more consistent play out of that position.
We're looking for a little bit more consistent play. The interesting part was Burford is as talented or more talented than Dominic Pooney. Dominic Pooney, they got in the 3rd round. They traded up to get him. Spencer Burford, they got in the 4th round. What did he talk about earlier? What's the difference between a guy you take at 34 and a guy you take at 54? What's the difference between a guy you take in the 80s and a guy you take in the early 100s? These are extreme thought processes that the 49ers are going through. But what we do know is they believe they have guys who are talented. We know they have guys that are intelligent that need to make plays for this football team. So the 49ers are living in this area of, right now, we're drafting guys from rounds 2 through 5 that we believe we can develop into starting caliber players in the NFL. It doesn't mean it's always going to work. Sometimes there's going to be misses, but you're hoping that you're going to be able to find guys that you can locate that are going to be able to step in and make plays and start for your football team. An interesting concept, interesting philosophy that we've heard from Coach Chris Forster. It's a give and take method. It's a trade-off of skill player compared to offensive line. It seems to be a method the 49ers are going for where they find intelligent offensive linemen to play on the inside, and they try to find talented guys on the outside. And is it going to be the method that a lot of 49er fans love? I don't think so. But this is the method that they've learned to like. It was a proof of concept from what they saw in New England during the 2000s of valuing skill players over big-name offensive linemen. 49ers haven't completely bought into that method. Just look at Trent Williams. If they completely bought into that method, Trent Williams probably wouldn't be the left tackle of the 49ers. They paid him a lot of money. But they've bought in enough. And it used to be they made sure they paid their center. They've changed from that as well. Weston Richburg, Alex Mack, no more. Now it's an undrafted free agent in Jake Brendel. So they've definitely went into this category a little bit more on this philosophy. Is it going to pan out? They end up winning a Super Bowl, then yeah, proof of concept works. If they're able to get just enough line play to win, then it works. If Spencer Burford develops, that will definitely help a big way. If they get Dominic Puny and Spencer Burford to end up starting at guards, you got to feel like this method is at least feasible. I don't know what the overall outcome is going to be, and I don't know if we're ever going to know what the outcome of this philosophy is going to be. But one thing I do know is there's something that has to happen. If you're going to be drafting consistently offensive linemen from rounds 2 through 5, you have to make sure you hit on them. And here's why Chris Forster says you have to make sure you hit on them.
And you got to be right, because oftentimes when you draft a lineman in the 4th or 5th round, there might be a guy that could come in immediately and contribute on special teams, contribute to be a backup linebacker, safety, and that's where. So I'm not okay. We didn't draft him first, second. We got to take somebody in the 4th round here because I got 5 guys, got 5 holes to fill. So
yeah, it's 5 spots to fill, but you have to hit on them because then you start losing out on backup safeties and linebackers and guys that can really help your football team on special teams, which is a key ingredient to a successful team and a well-rounded team. So it's one of those things where you can't miss. Every time you miss on an offensive lineman in that category, it could have been somebody else that helped your team right away. Because if you're going with a draft and development process, that means it's going to take time. Dominic Puny, though he was taken in the 3rd round, may not play in 2024. And if that's the case, what is the value of Dominic Puny in 2025 compared to a player that would have helped you right now? That's another trade-off and another give and take. This philosophy for the 49ers is pretty clear. They're going out and they're looking for guys in that 2nd through 5th round range that they believe are super intelligent, are coaches on the field, and have a desire to work and get better and overcome shortcomings that are athletically on their plate. They're not as good athletically compared to the other guys around them, but they make up for it in intelligence and football intelligence. So the philosophy is simple. Let's get an offensive lineman that we believe we can develop, turn into a suitable starter, and let's spend our money elsewhere. What does that mean for Aaron Banks? Probably doesn't mean an extension unless it's willing to be cheap. Laken Tomlinson gone, Mike McGlinchey gone. Cole McKivitt's got a very nice little money, in his contract, but it could mean Banks is gone. And it might mean that no one gets re-signed. They might just continue this method over and over and over. Skimping the offensive line seems to be a little bit of the philosophy. It ends up being just enough to get it done, and you stay above that level like Coach Chris Forster's talking about, could end up with a Super Bowl. We'll see. It's all going to play out on the field, but it's a fun thing to get to understand. Now we know his philosophy. We can't be surprised when the 49ers don't strike on big-time offensive linemen early in drafts at any point. At some point, they're going to have to try, right, and get a left tackle for Trent Williams, but we'll see. We'll see what they end up doing. He also talked about this interview a lot about Jalen Moore and how much they like him, so I'll end up doing a Jalen Moore episode as well. I hope you guys will all come through for that, and I appreciate you coming by for this episode. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you're listening on audio platform, which is available on all audio platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen, 49ers Cutback on Believe. Please give it a 5-star rating. And, this episode is brought to you by Bet Online. The game starts here. I'll catch you guys on the next one. Until then, stay safe. And remember, the right way is always the 49ers way.